There is a field in the hill country of central Anatolia, not far from a village so small it does not appear on most maps, where the soil is the color of old rust, and the wind comes off the plateau in the autumn with a coldness that has no patience for anything fragile. Most travelers who have passed through that part of the country, and not many have, would look at the land and see nothing remarkable. Dry, stony, the kind of ground that discourages ambition and rewards only the most stubborn persistence. But if you had stood at the edge of that particular field in the autumn of 1931, if you had been there in the thin morning light when the harvest was finally brought in, you would have seen something that nobody in that region had seen before. And nobody who saw it forgot it. The yield was 3 times what the neighboring fields produced. 3 times. On soil that every farmer in the district had already written off as spent, as finished, as good for nothing but grazing goats that had nowhere else to be. And the man who had grown it, a farmer named Halil, 61 years old, a widower, a man the village had privately regarded for 2 years as having lost his mind, stood at the edge of his field in his old coat and said nothing. He had known all along what they had not. He had buried glass in his field. Not a little glass, thousands of pieces, collected over 2 winters from broken windows, from discarded bottles, from the ruins of a derelict farmhouse 3 miles up the track. He had buried it 8 inches deep across nearly 2 acres of his worst ground, working alone, in the early mornings before the village was properly awake, saying nothing to anyone about what he was doing or why. They thought he had gone strange with grief. They were wrong. What Halil understood, what he had worked out, slowly and imperfectly and entirely on his own, from 40 years of watching soil behave, was something that agricultural science would not formally confirm for another generation. Something about light and moisture and the particular stubbornness of seeds that are given the right conditions to insist on surviving. This is his story. And it is also the story of what the earth will do when someone takes the trouble to understand it. Before we go any further into Halil's field and the strange logic behind what he did, I want to say something directly to you, because you came here for a reason. Most gardening content will give you a list, 10 tips, 5 tricks, a quick fix you can apply this weekend. And some of that is useful in its way. But this channel is built on a different belief. It is built on the belief that the most important gardening knowledge human beings have ever produced was not written in textbooks. It was lived. It was discovered by people like Halil, ordinary people, working ordinary ground in difficult circumstances, who paid close enough attention to the soil beneath their hands that they understood things the experts hadn't yet named. Every story on this channel carries real knowledge inside it. Knowledge about soil, about water, about the way plants behave when they are struggling and the way they behave when they are thriving, and what the difference actually looks like from the outside if you know how to read it. We tell it through the people who discovered it, because that is how it was discovered, not in laboratories, but in fields like Halil's, by hands that were too cold and too tired to be anything other than honest. If that is the kind of understanding you are looking for, subscribe to this channel. The button is there. The bell beside it means the next story comes to you the moment it arrives, without you having to go looking for it. We do not publish often, but when we do, it is worth your time. Now, back to Halil, and the glass, and what he knew that nobody else had thought to ask. Halil Demirci had been farming the same land since he was 14 years old, when his father placed a hoe in his hands and pointed at the western field and said, in the way of fathers who consider explanation a luxury, that the weeds needed dealing with. The farm had been in the family for 3 generations. Not because it was good land. It was not, particularly. The soil in that part of Anatolia is ancient and thin, the product of millennia of wind and seasonal drought, and the particular indifference of a climate that gives rain in winter and withholds it precisely when the growing things need it most. But the land was theirs, and in that part of the world, in that era, land that was yours was not something you set aside because it was difficult. Halil had grown wheat on it, as his father had, and barley. A kitchen garden behind the house where his wife Fatma had grown tomatoes and peppers, and the dark, thin-skinned aubergines that she sliced and salted and laid out on the flat roof to dry in August. Onions and garlic along the southern wall, because the southern wall held the heat of the day longest and gave it back slowly through the night. Fatma had understood these things with the instinctive precision of a woman who had grown up watching her own mother garden, and had absorbed the logic of it without ever being taught it directly. Fatma had died in the spring of 1929, a fever that came quickly and did not leave. She was 53. Halil had managed the farm alone since then. The children, 2 sons and a daughter, had married and moved to the larger towns. They wrote letters. They were dutiful. But the farm was his, and he was not a man who asked for help with things he could do himself. The summer of 1929 was a poor one. The rains came late, then stopped early, leaving the grain fields with a dry spell at exactly the wrong moment in the growing cycle, the point when the ears are forming and the plant needs water more than it needs anything else. The yield was poor. Not catastrophic, but poor enough to matter. The summer of 1930 was worse. By the autumn of 1930, Halil had a field, the western field, the difficult one, the one his father had pointed him at with the hoe all those years ago, that had produced so little for 2 consecutive years that continuing to plant it in the same way, in the same hope, seemed to him not like persistence, but like a slow, dignified form of foolishness. He stopped one evening at the edge of that field, just before dark, and looked at it the way a man looks at a problem he has been avoiding long enough that it has begun to feel personal. The soil was cracked in the way that exhausted Anatolian soil cracks, not just surface cracks, but deep ones, the kind that show the ground is giving up its moisture too quickly and too completely, that there is nothing below to hold it. The color was wrong. It had the pale, chalky look of soil that has been leached of its darker, richer components by years of cultivation without adequate return. He crouched down and picked up a handful, let it run through his fingers. It ran too easily. Good soil clings a little. Good soil has weight and moisture and a smell, that deep, particular smell of living earth, of the microorganisms that make soil into something more than ground. This soil had almost no smell at all. He stood up. He looked at the field for a long time. Then he went inside and made tea and sat by the window until it was fully dark, thinking. The thing Halil remembered had happened 30 years before. He had been in his early 30s, working a distant part of the farm that abutted an old track, when he had noticed something at the edge of a ditch that had always puzzled him slightly, and that he had never, until that moment, looked at carefully enough to understand. The ditch had, at some point in the distant past, been used as a dumping ground for broken household glass. Old bottles, a shattered window frame's worth of glass pieces, thick and greenish the way old glass is, half buried and half exposed by decades of seasonal earth movement. Someone's casual disposal of a breakage, long forgotten. But the ground immediately around that glass, in a rough radius of perhaps 4 feet in every direction, grew differently. Not better in the way of ground that has been amended with manure or ash or bone meal. Differently. The weeds that grew there were the kind that preferred moisture. The soil itself, when he had pushed a stick into it, was noticeably damper than the surrounding earth, even in the middle of a dry July. He had noticed it, filed it away in the back of his mind with the particular instinct of a farmer who observes everything and explains nothing until the explanation makes itself obvious. Then he had moved on, because there was always more work. Sitting by his window in the autumn of 1930, 30 years later, he brought it back. What was happening at that ditch, he now believed, was this. The glass, buried at a shallow depth, angled in the random, chaotic way of thrown and settled fragments, was catching the light. Not in the obvious mirror-like way of glass in direct sun, but in the subtle, diffuse way of glass buried at angles underground, catching the morning and afternoon light as it shifted across the season, bending it downward into the soil. And where light goes in a more diffuse and gentle way than direct sunlight, warmth follows. And where warmth holds in the soil, moisture follows more slowly, evaporates more reluctantly, stays. He was not. He would have been the first to tell you, a scientific man. He could not have explained this in the language of physics or agronomy. But he had 40 years of watching soil and understanding its behavior in the practical, functional way of someone whose survival depended on getting that understanding right. And what he believed, sitting by his window with his tea going cold, was that the glass acted on the soil the way a cold frame acts on a seedbed, moderating temperature, holding moisture, creating a microclimate just different enough from the surrounding ground to make a measurable difference to what grew there. The question was whether it would work at scale. He decided to find out. He started collecting glass in November of 1930. He was methodical about it, in the way he was methodical about everything. He made a wooden box, a shallow, flat box with handles, the kind you could carry comfortably over rough ground, and he began working outward from the farm in a radius, covering the tracks and the abandoned plots and the ruins he knew from a lifetime of walking this land. He was looking for glass of all kinds, old bottle glass, which was common enough, the thick, greenish, slightly imperfect glass of bottles that had been made in the previous century, bottles for Reiki and vinegar and medicine. Window glass, when he could find it, which was rarer and more fragile and required more care to transport. The remains of a pressed glass lamp globe he found in the ruins of a house that had been empty for 20 years. He broke the larger pieces deliberately, carefully, wrapping them in old sacking before striking them so the fragments stayed contained. He did not want shards so fine they would simply dissolve back into the soil. He wanted pieces the size of a hand or 2 hands, large enough to hold their angle when buried, large enough to have a surface area that could catch and redirect light. He worked 2 mornings a week through November and December in the cold before the village woke. Not because he was ashamed of what he was doing exactly, but because he understood, with the clear-eyed realism of a man who has lived in a small community his entire life, that what he was doing would look, to anyone watching, like grief-induced eccentricity. A widower, alone, carrying boxes of broken glass across frozen fields before dawn. There was no version of that story that ended with the village thinking well of him. So he worked quietly, alone, and he said nothing. By January, he had enough glass to begin. He dug trenches across the western field in a grid, rows spaced 4 feet apart, the trenches themselves 8 inches deep. Into each trench, he laid the glass fragments in a single loose layer, angled at roughly 45 degrees where he could manage it, though in practice they settled into whatever angle the digging allowed. Then he filled the trenches back in, tamped the soil down flat, and raked the surface smooth. The field, when he finished, looked exactly as it had before. Nothing visible, nothing that could be pointed at or questioned or explained. But 8 inches below the surface of that exhausted, cracked, pale-soiled field, 2 acres of broken glass lay in the dark, waiting for spring. He planted wheat, the same variety he had always grown, the hard, drought-resistant Anatolian wheat that his father had planted and his grandfather before him. He planted it at the standard depth, in the standard rows, at the standard density. He gave the field no additional treatment, no manure, no amendment of any kind. He wanted to know what the glass alone would do, without any other variable to confuse the result. The spring of 1931 was not a generous one. It rained adequately in March, then turned dry through April and into May, the critical weeks when winter wheat is putting on its final growth before the ears begin to form. The other fields in the district showed it. The crops came up thin and pale, the stems shorter than ideal, the tillering, the way wheat puts out side shoots to multiply itself, limited by the lack of available moisture. In Halil's western field, the wheat tillered as if the spring had been wet. Not dramatically, not obviously from a distance. But when you walked the rows, and Halil walked them every morning, slowly, looking, you could see it. The stems were fractionally taller, the color was fractionally deeper, that particular blue-green of wheat that has enough moisture, as opposed to the yellow-green of wheat that is beginning to stress. The tillering was producing more secondary shoots per plant than the surrounding fields, and the soil, when he pushed his finger into it 2 inches below the surface, held its moisture for longer after rain, and lost it more slowly in the dry spells between. The glass was not creating water from nothing. That is not what was happening. What was happening was more subtle and more profound than that. The glass fragments, buried at their various angles, were doing 2 things simultaneously. They were reducing the rate of evaporation from the soil above them, acting as a partial barrier that slowed the upward movement of moisture to the surface where the wind and the sun could take it. And they were acting as passive solar collectors, absorbing the day's warmth and releasing it slowly through the night, keeping the soil temperature slightly more stable than the surrounding unmodified ground, which in turn kept the microbial activity in the soil slightly more active, which in turn made more nutrients available to the root systems of the wheat above. Halil did not know the mechanism in those terms, but he knew the result. He could see it. Walking his rows in May, in the dry spring, watching his western field behave as though it had received rain it had not received, he knew he had been right. He still said nothing to anyone. Not yet. The harvest came in the first week of August. By then, the difference between Halil's western field and the surrounding land was visible from the track. You did not need to walk the rows or push your finger into the soil or know anything particular about wheat to see it. The field was simply taller, fuller. The ears, the grain-bearing heads of the wheat, were longer and heavier than those of the neighboring crops, bowed slightly with their own weight in the way that good wheat bows, the way that means the grains inside are fully formed and dense. People noticed before the harvest. They had been noticing since June, in the quiet, watchful way of farming communities where everyone knows everyone else's land, and any deviation from expectation is registered immediately, even if nothing is said. By July, 3 of his neighbors had walked over, on various pretexts, to look more closely. They examined the crop with the practiced, unhurried attention of farmers assessing something they do not understand. They looked at the soil, they looked at the rows. One of them crouched and dug with his fingers and held up a handful of the earth and rubbed it between his palms and looked at it for a long time. None of them asked Halil directly what he had done. In the particular social grammar of that community, asking directly would have implied that you had noticed, which would have implied that your own field compared unfavorably, which was not a position a man of self-respect put himself in voluntarily. So they looked and said nothing, and went away and thought about it. The harvest was brought in over 3 days. Halil worked it himself, as he worked everything, with the help of his youngest son, who had come from the town for the week. The threshing was done by hand, in the old way, on the flat stone at the edge of the farm. And when the grain was measured and the yield was calculated, when the numbers were in front of him in the practical, concrete reality of sacks of grain stacked against the farmhouse wall, even Halil, who had believed in what he was doing from the beginning, was quiet for a moment. 3 times the yield of the previous 2 years on that field. 3 times, in a year when every other field in the district had produced less than usual. His son looked at the sacks, looked at his father, said, "What did you do to that field?" And Halil, for the first time, told someone. By the end of that week, the whole village knew. And the reaction was not, it should be said, entirely admiring. There were people who said he had simply been lucky, that the western field had, by chance, sat over a different soil layer that year, one with more natural moisture. There were people who said the measurement was exaggerated. There were people who said they had always known Halil was a man who did things in a peculiar way, and that this was simply the latest example. But there were also, in the 2 autumns that followed, 4 other farmers in the district who quietly dug their own trenches in their own difficult fields and laid their own broken glass in the dark below their worst ground. None of them announced what they were doing. None of them gave Halil credit publicly, but the knowledge moved in the way that useful knowledge moves in farming communities, sideways and silently, from hand to hand, without ceremony. Let us stay in that field for a moment, because what Halil had discovered deserves to be understood properly, not just as a story, as knowledge. The principle at work in his western field was what we would now call passive soil moisture conservation combined with thermal mass management. It sounds complicated. It is not complicated. It is simply the application of physics to the problem of keeping water where plants need it. Soil loses moisture in two ways. Through direct evaporation at the surface, which is accelerated by wind and sun and heat, and through drainage downward, which is governed by the soil's texture and structure and the speed at which water moves through it. In a dry, cracked, compacted soil like Halil's western field, the problem was primarily the first kind. The surface cracking that had developed over years of drought and cultivation created channels through which moisture moved upward rapidly, reaching the surface and being taken by the wind and the sun before the plant roots could intercept it. The glass layer, buried 8 inches down, did not stop this entirely, but it slowed it. The fragments, lying at their various angles in the dark, created a zone of partial impermeability, not a solid barrier, but a disruption to the upward capillary movement of water through the soil. Moisture moving upward from the deeper soil layers reached the glass layer and slowed. Some of it moved around the fragments, some of it stayed, held at the level of the glass by surface tension and by the slightly lower temperature that the glass maintained through the night. The root zone of the wheat, concentrated in the first 12 to 16 inches of soil, had access to that moisture for longer than the roots in the surrounding, unmodified fields. The thermal effect was secondary, but real. Glass absorbs solar energy during daylight hours and releases it slowly as infrared radiation through the night. A layer of glass fragments buried at shallow depth acts, in miniature, like the thermal mass systems that modern passive solar buildings use, absorbing heat when it is available and releasing it when the temperature drops. In Halil's field, this meant the root zone stayed warmer on cold spring nights, which kept the soil biology more active, which meant the organic material in the soil, what little there was broken down more consistently into the mineral forms that plant roots can actually absorb. And there is a third effect, which is the one that modern research on glass mulch systems has found most significant: albedo modification. The surface of buried glass reflects some proportion of the incoming light back upward through the soil, in a diffuse and scattered way, reaching the underside of the leaf canopy of the plants above. Plants use light from below as well as from above. It is less efficient, but it contributes. In Halil's field, the glass was, in a very small way, doubling the light available to the growing wheat from a direction it did not normally receive it. None of this is magic. All of it is physics. Halil had not invented anything new. He had observed a natural phenomenon, understood its practical implication, and applied it at scale with the patient, methodical intelligence of a man who had been reading the behavior of soil for 40 years. This is how most of the genuinely useful agricultural knowledge in human history was discovered. Not in controlled trials by men with instruments, in fields, by people paying attention. Halil farmed the western field for 11 more years, until his eldest son took over the farm in 1942. The glass remained in the ground throughout that period. He did not dig it up or move it. He simply planted over it each spring, in the knowledge that it was there below, doing its quiet work. The yield was not 3 times the surrounding fields every year. Weather is not that cooperative, and no single intervention transforms difficult soil into good soil permanently. But it was consistently better. In good years, significantly better. In poor years, in the dry years that continued to come with the regularity that the Anatolian climate imposes on the people who live in it, the difference was greatest. The glass field held on when the neighboring fields were failing. It was the last to show stress and the first to recover. He added to the glass layer twice in those 11 years, in 1934 and again in 1938, when he noticed the effect beginning to diminish slightly in the oldest treated areas. He dug new trenches between the original ones and laid fresh glass, working the field in sections so that it was never out of production for more than a season in any given part. It was, he observed to his son once, like maintaining a wall. You did not rebuild it all at once, you kept it up, section by section, and it kept doing its work. The glass is almost certainly still there. In the soil of that field, in the hill country of central Anatolia, under whatever is growing there now, if anything is, the fragments that Halil collected in the cold mornings of 1930 and 1931 are still buried at their various angles in the dark, doing nothing visible, changing nothing obviously. But the soil above them is different from the soil that surrounds them. It has been different for nearly a century. The slightly higher moisture retention, the slightly more stable thermal regime, the slightly more active biology. These things accumulate over decades. Soil is not static. It is a living system, and a living system that is consistently treated slightly better than its neighbors becomes, over time, a genuinely better soil. Not by dramatic transformation, by the patient, invisible accumulation of small advantages. That is what Halil left behind him. Not a discovery that was written up and published and credited to him. Not a technique that bears his name in any agricultural textbook. Just a field that grows things slightly better than it should, for reasons that the people farming it now may not know, or may not think to ask. And the knowledge itself, passed sideways through a farming community, from hand to hand, in the particular silent way that truly useful knowledge travels, carried further than he knew. There are glass mulch cultivation trials being conducted today in arid regions of Turkey, of Iran, of parts of sub-Saharan Africa that are discovering, with instruments and controlled conditions and peer-reviewed methodology, exactly what Halil discovered alone in his field in the winter of 1930. The science confirms what he knew. The science is catching up to the observation. He would not have been surprised. I want to leave you with something that I find myself thinking about when I consider Halil's story. We tend, in conversations about agriculture and food and the management of the earth, to place our trust in the large, the official, the credentialed, in the research institute, in the government program, in the expert with the instruments and the published findings. And that trust is not misplaced. The instruments find things that no individual farmer, working alone, could ever isolate or measure. But the instruments are always looking at things that someone first noticed without them. Halil noticed. He noticed because he was paying attention, because 40 years of working the same difficult ground had given him the kind of knowledge that cannot be taught in a classroom, the kind that lives in your hands and your eyes, and in the particular quality of attention that comes from caring, deeply, and over a long time, about whether a piece of ground produces or fails. That quality of attention is the oldest gardening tool there is. It predates the hoe and the plow and the irrigation channel. It is what made all of those things possible. It is what Halil had, standing at the edge of his western field in the autumn of 1930, looking at soil that everyone else had written off. The glass was just glass. The knowledge was what mattered. And the knowledge came from looking. If this story has stayed with you, if there is something in Halil's patience, in the quiet logic of what he did that you are still turning over in your mind, then I have a question I would like to put to you in the comments. Have you ever noticed something in your own garden or your own ground that you could not immediately explain? Something a plant did, or something the soil did, that did not match what you expected, and that turned out, when you paid closer attention, to mean something? Tell me. The comments on this channel are where the real conversation happens, and I read every one. Your observation may be the beginning of the next story we tell here. If you are not yet part of this community, if this is the first story of ours you have found, the channel is called The Anatolian Peasant Farmers. Every story we bring you is built the same way this one was, from real knowledge, lived by real people, told with the care it deserves. Subscribe if you believe that kind of storytelling is worth preserving. The next chronicle is already waiting. The field is still there. The glass is still in the ground. And somewhere, in a farming community you have never heard of, someone is paying close enough attention to the soil beneath their hands that they are about to understand something the rest of us have not yet thought to ask. That is always how it begins.